Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Are China and Japan headed for a new level of détente? The leaders may be meeting soon, and our guest thinks this could be a game changer. Now joining us again for our series of discussions, which I've been calling under the title, They're Not Fit to Rule, again, is Gerald Horne. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So once again, Gerald Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And his recent books are Storming the Heavens, African Americans and the Early Fight for the Right to Fly, and The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. So why is this such a big deal if the presidents of China and Japan meet, and why do you think it's happening now?
Well, it's no secret that for a goodly section of the U.S. ruling elite, China is right now in the crosshairs. When they make their projections, they see a 21st century that might be an Asian century spearheaded by Beijing. This is a dystopian nightmare for certain sectors in Washington that they would like to block that, which then led, of course, to this alliance or supposed alliance between the United States and Japan and Australia and India targeting China. There have been a number of steps in that direction.
Obama called it the Asian pivot.
Exactly. But how can you have an Asian pivot if Japan leaps into bed with China? Not only that, but viewers and listeners should pay very close and careful attention to Japan's relationship with Russia. Recall that when the Sochi Olympics were boycotted just a couple of years ago, that Tokyo did not boycott those Olympics. There were high-level meetings in Sochi between the Japanese Prime Minister and President Putin. There have been repeated delegations flowing between Moscow and Tokyo. Part of this has to do with the fact that Tokyo wants to reclaim some islands that Russia now controls as a result of the post-1945, post-World War II dispensation, and there have been many talks about this. But part of it, it seems to me, has something to do with the kind of unease that is felt by the Japanese ruling elite with regard to where Mr. Trump is taking the North Atlantic community and where the United States itself is going. And then, of course, there's unease with regard to Mr. Trump's maneuvers on the Korean Peninsula. There's this old saying in Japan that they like Korea so much that they would prefer to have two of them. However, with Mr. Trump pushing for peace between North and South, which might be seen as a predicate or a prelude to some sort of confederation or some sort of quasi-united Korea, that presents a nightmare for Japan, given the hostility historically on both sides of the DMZ, North and South in Korea, towards Tokyo because of its brutal colonial rule from 1910 to 1945. So Japan has decided, it seems to me at least, to embark on a new path, and this could be a game changer.
So an alliance of sorts between Japan and China and creating this Asian bloc that could be the most powerful bloc in the world. In fact, I would guess if you had a real cooperation of some sort between China and Japan, it's already would be bigger than the American GDP. You put these two together. Of course, they wouldn't rival American military power. And it might even push the Americans to even put more money into their military. But why hasn't it happened already? It seems like such a kind of an obvious thing that Japan would want to try to do this.
Well, as I'm sure you know,
China.
There's this historical hostility stretching back to the war of the 1890s that Japan waged against a tottering China. Goes back to the depredations inflicted upon China by Imperial Japan during World War II, which you could fairly say last in China from 1931 till 1945. And to a certain degree, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party rests upon its role during that 1931 to 1945 conflict, where it was in the vanguard of fighting the Japanese invaders. And China rather adroitly has helped to stir up anti-Japanese sentiments. I recall not so long ago when there were raucous demonstrations at Japanese enterprises in China, despite the fact that Japan has poured millions, if not billions of dollars into Chinese enterprises. But having said all that, with the apparent impending summit between President Xi Jinping of China and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, assuming that he's not forced out of office within the next 4 to 6 weeks. This could be as profound and as significant as Nixon's trip to China to meet with Mao Zedong some 45 odd years ago.
Now, while the Chinese historical experience with Japan and the nationalism in China against Japan, you have the same thing in Japan. A very strong nationalist movement in Japan who the idea of an alliance of sorts with China would have to mean Japan to some extent playing second fiddle to China. And Japan can kind of live with playing second fiddle to the United States. Partly they didn't have any choice after World War II. How do these nationalisms actually, how does this work out? Because I would think there'd be like an enormous opposition to this in Japan.
I think you're right, but keep in mind, number one, there is a relatively strong left-wing movement in Japan, certainly stronger than it is in the United States, which might not be saying that much, which historically has had ties of various sorts with the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, if you look at the anti-Japanese resistance in China from 1931 to 1945, a good deal of that resistance was actually spearheaded by Japanese nationals who were tied to the Japanese left. But having said that, I think that the premise of your inquiry is accurate, that there will be stiff opposition to any sort of entente with China.
That the Americans will fuel.
Exactly. However, given the concomitant unease about Mr. Trump in Tokyo and where he's taking the United States and his studied insults to Japan, for example, as noted, not lifting the steel tariffs against Japan while lifting them against other so-called allies, that may be enough to overcome those sorts of nationalist passions in Japan.
And perhaps also they see Trump as a symptom of the whole decay of the American political system. And with that decay, the weakening of the management of global capitalism by the United States. And if the Americans aren't there to manage the next big crisis, and if it's a Trump character who says, hey, we're not bailing out anybody else but Americans, because we know the Fed helped bail out Europeans and many others around the world in 07, 08. And whether the Fed even has the tools to bail out the next big one, and everyone's assuming the next big one is, well, it's kind of due based on this 10-year cycle. Maybe all this new stimulus money they're spending on the military and domestically in the new budget, maybe it puts it off past 2020, but there's another big one coming. If they don't trust this American system and the American elites to manage this stuff anymore, then maybe there's a sense of urgency about a China-Japanese entente, which can transcend some of this history.
Well, it reminds me of a couple things. I recall when former U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally under Nixon said about the U.S. dollar that it's our currency but your problem, which was a prelude to the squeeze that the United States put on Tokyo in the 1980s when there was the so-called Japanic, when you had movies like Rising Sun, which portrayed Japan as on the verge of ruling the world, when it was said that the territory around the Japanese Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than everything in the state of California. This led to this squeeze on Japan that many have yet to forget, the so-called Plaza Accord engineered by U.S. Secretary James Baker under Ronald Wilson Reagan, which fundamentally wrecked the Japanese economy for 2 decades to follow. So all of these are fresh memories in Tokyo. They may not be fresh memories in Washington. And dredging up those memories could be a useful prelude to helping to prepare the population for this U-turn, if you like, that is to say, a gathering entente between Japan and China.
All right, thanks for joining us. We'll continue this conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.